Hello, welcome to the third Feast Your Mind lunchtime lecture. Today I'm going to talk to you about what is dystopia. Your knowledge nugget, I've mentioned kind of where you can trace the word dystopia back to, and I just want you to hold in your mind that date of 1747. So in this session I'm going to cover what the genre of dystopia is, what the history of it is, and try to get to the crux of why we enjoy it so much. And I'm going to start by introducing you to this man here, Sir Thomas More. He was an English lawyer, a social philosopher, and an author. He was also the Chancellor to Henry VIII. And thinking about your knowledge of the history of who Henry VIII is and what he's renowned for, he's a very famous figure in history. It links to why Thomas More was so famous and so known at this time. There are two things he's known for. The first notable thing is his death in 1535, when he refused himself to acknowledge King Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England. And this actually led to him eventually being named as a saint to the Catholic Church for kind of standing up for what he believed in. But the other notable thing that he's known for is he wrote a book in 1516 called Utopia. And so this word utopia means an imagined perfect place. The idea that you've come up with what you think would be perfect. But then if you actually look at the origins of the word utopia, so where it's come from, so when he created it, it means not place. So effectively means nowhere. So he's created this word meaning a perfect imagined place, which is nowhere. It doesn't exist. It's not possible. So he's used it in an ironic way. He's trying to criticise this idea of perfection. It's not possible. So in the book, you can see here then from the British Library, an early manuscript of it, he comes up with this island where everything is perfect, everyone has the same ideals, everyone has the same values. And ultimately, this book is a satire. It's there to criticise the government, to criticise the politics in Europe at this time and what they're trying to do. So we have this creation, this early concept, this idea of utopia. But so this is in the 1500s. I ask you to keep in mind that date of 1747. So dystopia then, on the converse, when you look at its origins, translates to bad utopia as a literal translation. So that's what it means. But this word's only coming up a few hundred years after utopia. It means the direct opposite. And so when we think of the definition, it's an imagined place or state in which everything is unpleasant or bad, so everything's gone wrong. It's typically totalitarian or an environmentally degraded one. And I'll talk a bit more about what those two things mean later on. But this idea then, utopia, an imagined perfect place, a dystopia, meaning kind of an unhappy country. And the historian Gregory Claeys points out that he did a big study into dystopia and its history and where it came from. And he has his own definition of what he thinks actually dystopia as a genre is. Because quite often people say dystopia is a book set in the future, an imagined future. But he actually says that it can be both apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic. So it doesn't matter when it's being set. It doesn't have to be either of those, but ultimately it has to be anti-utopian. A utopia turned upside down, a world in which people tried to build a republic of perfection, only to find that they had created a republic of misery. Dystopia has really reached a pinnacle of popularity over the last 100 years. So when we're thinking of dystopia, where it's come from, where it's built its popularity, it really is only in the last century that we saw it become a genre and build and build and build till it's become this product that we're really familiar with. And a lot of people just don't know the word dystopia itself, but we read so many of the books and consume so many films and TV shows based around it. And the idea of the genre of dystopia is that it reflects our fears on society. So whatever our current fear is at the time, you'll start to see dystopian books kind of playing with that and imagining if that fear played out, if that thing went wrong. So with that, it makes sense that the modern dystopian novel emerged at the turn of the 20th century. Historically, it was quite a time of anxiety and unrest. We're almost at the world wars kind of at that time. And so one of the earliest examples we get then is a novel called Iron Heel that comes out in 1908 by Jack London. And people looked at this because in this book it's almost like he prophesied or predicted that the World War was going to happen. And so people kind of saw that and those tensions coming up. And so we can see that the fears of that time about more war and more fighting were already there. And they do actually arrive in reality, but he imagined that, he took that fear and imagined it. But as a genre itself, dystopia doesn't really become that defined yet. So we say here's an early example, it doesn't quite fit all of the categories of what we try and say a dystopian fiction should have now. But we see that arrive in 1921 with the novel, very short novel, We. And in this fiction we see this ideal society, but before this point anything dystopian normally ended in almost a utopia, so everything went well by the end. But with we start to see this change. We see the tropes of dystopia where you kind of get a troubled, unresolved ending. Normally you have kind of a totalitarian government gone mad. So totalitarianism, I've just given you the graphic here, so of where you've got this state government that's complete control over everything in your life. So they control the media, your family, religion, and so they control it so much that you have no freedom. And we can see why concerns about totalitarianism come into these books. So with the ones that follow then, so 1939 with Brave New World, 1949 with George Orwell and 1984, all concern themselves with this idea of totalitarianism. And if you look, Hitler was a totalitarian government. He controlled all those elements of your lives, told you how to act, told you how to behave. And you had other examples in the world at that time. And so we can see that's a fear of the loss of freedom, a fear of loss of power, a fear that we'll lose control. And these come up in these books. With George Orwell himself, the book 1984 comes up this idea of Big Brother. So the totalitarian government are known as Big Brother, and it said that Big Brother is always watching you. And that phrase in itself means something different to us now. It was so popular, this book, that in the early 2000s we get the reality TV show Big Brother created off of his book. So it shows how important this book has felt to people through time, that we end up with this TV show that was a really popular show. It's only just stopped running. And the idea came, and it was meant to be a social experiment. So it was meant to be to see how do people act and behave when they're confined and watched 24/7 and told how to act and how to behave. And you could see that people acted really negatively. It affected their behaviours and their emotions and had a really big and stark impact on them. And so this image here just being part of the film version of 1984, where that's an image of kind of Big Brother and then pretending to praise the government. That was part of what they were told to do. And the phrases, the statements that were made towards them that they had to believe in. And so it shows you this idea that to someone that was perfect, that was a utopia, that everyone would think the same and everyone would act the same and we'd all do exercise at the same time and things like that. But actually it creates misery. The main character feels miserable. He goes along with it, he doesn't protest it, but he just feels this never-ending misery inside. And then as time goes on, you start to see it develop in the fears in the world. So in 1968, we get the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And this book, you start to see the merging of dystopia with sci-fi, we get this two mixing together, and it's quite interesting because if you think of what's happening at that time in history, we have the moon landing start to happen, we've got the Cold War going on between Russia and America, and we've got so much advancement in technology. And that's what people are really worried about. We're worried about what it means to go into space, what it means to have all this new technology. And so the fears now are about a slightly different thing. We've moved away from the wars, so the fears aren't so much about our government, but our fears are now about those things now existing in our world and being created. So as time goes on, we get more fears and different fears come up. In 1985, we have The Handmaid's Tale, which is a story about where women are controlled. And so we start to think, well, maybe the media and advertising, the way they presented women as this ideal object, as this baby making machine almost, and that's what we see this book focus on, where women are seen as less than men. And so dystopia allows us a platform to reflect on our fears and reflect on what's going on. And as time goes on, then we get more and more. In 1994, we start to see a shift in the genre. Originally, dystopia was a genre for adults, but now we almost see it as a genre for teenagers. That's who it's mainly aimed at. So we start to see Never Let Me Go in 2005, and The Hunger Games, which I think is probably now one of the most famous after 1984 of the dystopian kind of novels. And we get other ones like Divergent and Ready Player One, and we're seeing this big shift. Dystopia is becoming even bigger in terms of the world. The books take place, it's not just one novel, it's a series of novels. So they become even more complex, the systems and the situations they're in. They're becoming more violent, they're becoming darker, and it's a lot more about the individual fighting against this oppression or the politics or the governments going on. So we're actually seeing our dystopia move back to the time of the World Wars. So it's thinking about what our fears are that relate to that. And when we think about these books, it's always thinking about why do we enjoy them so much? Why is dystopia so popular, and why has it got more popular? And I think in parcel with the books, it's all looking at the films that have been coming up. So most of those books have been made into films. They were so popular as a book, so why not adapt them to the big screen? The Hunger Games and Divergent have been massive blockbusters, making millions and millions of pounds at the box office. And it's thinking about why is the cinema investing so much in stories like these. I've put some examples up on the screen for you. Some of them are about natural disasters, so we can think about our fears of climate change. Some of them are about population, so thinking about how we deal with the amount of people on the planet. Others are about the intelligence of animals, so I think Planet of the Apes. And I think one of the things that is so engaging about the cinema is that you can sit in that room and have this imagined amazing visual feast in front of your eyes that you can sit there and absorb and reflect on and enjoy. But ultimately at the end you walk out and you go back to your normal life. So you have that kind of couple of hours where you can think, yeah, I am really concerned about that. I do have a fear about that. But you sit there and you think, well, actually, I am scared, but I don't think that's the future that's going to happen. And you can kind of then reassure yourself and make yourself feel that actually it's okay. I can be scared of it, but I can deal with that fear and I can deal with this world because my world is not like that. It's not that bad. And so it gives us that reflection of a world where it's reassurance. The cinema, we enjoy it, it's reassurance. And I think that's a big part of dystopia, making ourselves realise that, yes, that is something to be worried about, but it's never going to get to that point. And then finally thinking about dystopia on TV. So some examples I could think of were, to start with, The Man in the High Castle. And I find this really interesting. It's the idea of what would the world have been like if the Nazis had won the war, and it poses that and puts it in of what they think would have happened to the world. And I think I've heard so many people in live talk about, well, if this hadn't happened in the war, if the Americans hadn't helped us, or if this speech hadn't happened, or if this plan hadn't happened, the Germans would have won and they'd have taken over and we'd all be speaking German, this would be what would happen. And I think that's so interesting that there's still a little bit of that fear there. As much as it's so distant, the World War, we're still engaged with that idea of what would have happened, and it allows us to see that. Another example then is the 100. This is the idea that there's been a nuclear disaster and there's only 100 or so people left, and how they're going to live in this new world and create their government. And you can see where this fear has come from. We had Chernobyl in the 1980s, so a nuclear disaster, so we always feel like there's potential for another to happen, even though there's been so much put in place to prevent it. But there is one that I think is so close to the reality we are in. And so this is Black Mirror. So Charlie Brooker kind of came up with the concept of Black Mirror. So there's a lot of different series of it. They're all individual episodes, they don't link together. But he poses it that the idea of this program is to depict how we might live in 10 minutes if we were clumsy. So it's not a future that's 100 years away or 40 years away or 10 years away for him. It's the idea this could be tomorrow if we made some slight errors in our choices. And a lot of his focuses on the impact and the effects of smartphones, reality TV and social networking. And he looks at the darker side of this and the problems of it, and the idea the black mirror is meant to be that when your phone is locked and you look at the screen, that's the black mirror, that's you looking back at yourself and thinking how absorbed we are with our phones. And I think that is a big fear of ours. I think potentially as parents, as children, knowing that we've got these phones and these things, but we don't really know the impact they have. And so all these things, dystopia on the surface is quite a horrible genre to look at. It covers some not nice things. So if dystopia is meant to reflect our fears, why do we enjoy it so much? So I looked into it and thought, well, what is the psychology behind why we enjoy this? And I think it's quite close to the psychology behind why we enjoy horror films, why we like to be scared. And thinking in that moment when you're watching it, there'll be moments where you feel terror, genuine terror and horror, but your brain will take that and it'll immediately go, okay, how do I react to this terror? How do I react to this fear? And in that moment, it will start to go through the process of if you're in an actual situation, but then it realises that you are in a safe environment. It clocks on that you're watching something visual that's scary, but the environment you're in is safe. In that process, your brain has released dopamine, so a chemical in your brain that you release when you're scared, but you also release dopamine when you're excited. So your brain has suddenly gone, no, I'm safe. So now it's time to think, well, I'm excited now. And it changes that emotion, that reaction. So when we're there in that moment and watching a dystopian film, you're actually going, oh, this is scary, but this is actually quite exciting at the same time. Your brain is almost tricking you in that moment. And I think as well, it mixes over with our natural curiosity. We're interested in the darker side of things and knowing about that side, that we want to watch it. And the joy of watching and reading is you can walk away at the end and it doesn't exist anymore. It's a fantasy world, so it allows you to escape and explore it, but know that when you walk away, you are back in your normal world. And I think that's a massive part of why dystopia is so popular. I'd really recommend you to explore any of these films and books that I've mentioned. Know what's appropriate for your age. I would definitely recommend for the age of the students, The Hunger Games as a starting point if you haven't read or watched it already. But it's a fascinating side of art, and I think it's really worthwhile in just reflecting on our world and our society. Thank you.